What happens when a drunk driver hits someone in the early morning hours and then discovers the man he left bleeding on the sidewalk lives right next door to Judge Frank Caprio? This case was never just about a DUI. It was never just about a hit and run. It was about something far more uncomfortable. A judge forced to choose between what his heart felt and what the law demanded. On this Wednesday morning in Providence Municipal Court, the courtroom looked the same as it always did. The wooden benches, the quiet murmurs, the soft echo of footsteps on the tile floor. But behind the bench, something was different. Judge Frank Caprio sat reviewing his docket, and those who worked with him every day noticed it immediately. There was a weight in his expression, a heaviness that didn't belong to an ordinary case. His clerk, Maria Santos, had worked beside him for 15 years. She had seen compassion. She had seen disappointment. She had seen mercy and firmness in perfect balance. But she had never seen Judge Caprio look like this. Then she saw the name on the file, Antonio Tony Castellano, a 74-year-old man, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, Judge Caprio's next-door neighbor for more than 2 decades. In just a few minutes, a young man accused of drunk driving, leaving the scene, and nearly killing an elderly pedestrian would stand before the court. And the man he injured wasn't a stranger pulled from a police report. He was someone the judge waved to every morning. Someone whose garden he had watched grow year after year from his own kitchen window. This was the moment every judge hopes never comes. When the law steps into your personal life. When fairness becomes harder than mercy. And what Judge Frank Caprio chose to do next would test everything people believe about justice, integrity, and the courage to do what is right, especially when it hurts. Before we go any further, if you believe real justice isn't easy, if you believe the hardest cases reveal the truest character, make sure you're subscribed, because this story shows what happens when justice becomes personal. The bailiff's voice cut through the courtroom with practiced formality. Case number 2024 MC9847, the state of Rhode Island versus Derek Matthews. The doors opened and Derek Matthews walked in as if this were an inconvenience, not a reckoning. At 28 years old, he looked composed. Khaki pants, a clean button-down shirt, hair neatly combed, no visible signs of fear or shame. He carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who still believed this could all be explained away, reduced, forgotten. But what Derek Matthews didn't understand, what so many people don't, is that consequences don't care how put together you look. He approached the defendant's table beside a public defender whose posture told a very different story. The attorney had read the file. He knew the charges weren't light. Driving under the influence, leaving the scene of an accident with injuries, reckless endangerment. Each count carried weight. Together they told a story that couldn't be softened. Judge Frank Caprio looked up from the bench. For just a brief moment, something human flickered across his face. Pain. Recognition. Then it was gone. Replaced by the calm, measured presence the courtroom knew so well. "Mr. Matthews," he said evenly, "you are charged with driving under the influence, leaving the scene of an accident with injuries and reckless endangerment. These are serious charges. Do you understand them?" "Yes, Your Honor," Matthews replied. Casual, almost bored. "And how do you plead?" "Not guilty." The words landed flat. No hesitation, no reflection. Judge Caprio set down his pen. "Before we go any further," he said, "there is something everyone in this courtroom needs to know." The room grew quiet. "The victim in this case, Mr. Antonio Castellano, is my neighbor. I've known him for over 20 years. He lives next door to my family." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Heads turned, breath caught. Judge Caprio continued, his voice steady but transparent. "Because of that relationship, I am offering you, Mr. Matthews, the opportunity to request a different judge. If you believe my familiarity with the victim could affect my impartiality, I will recuse myself immediately." This was not weakness. This was integrity in real time. The public defender leaned in urgently, whispering to his client. Any experienced attorney would recognize this for what it was: a rare gift, a chance to reset the board. But Derek Matthews shook his head. "No, Your Honor," he said with a shrug. "I've heard you're fair. I'm fine with you as my judge." He thought fairness meant leniency. He thought fairness meant balance. What he didn't understand was that fairness also means accountability, especially when harm is done. "Very well," Judge Caprio said. "Then let's discuss the events of October 8th. In your own words, tell the court what happened." Matthews cleared his throat. "I was at a friend's house watching football. Had a few beers, 3 or 4. I was driving home down Elwood Avenue when this old guy stepped into the street. I didn't have time to stop. I barely touched him with my mirror. He fell. I didn't think it was serious. I had work early, so I left. The air changed. A murmur ran through the gallery. Some gasped. Others stared in disbelief. Judge Caprio didn't interrupt. He listened. Every word Matthews spoke revealed something deeper, not just about the incident, but about the man standing before the court. There was no concern for the person on the ground, no pause, no regret. Just a series of excuses delivered as if he were late for dinner, not fleeing the scene of a broken body. Judge Caprio's jaw tightened. Barely touched him, he repeated quietly. That was the moment this case stopped being about traffic law and became something else entirely. Because what lay ahead was not just the truth of what happened that night, but the truth of who Derek Matthews was when faced with the consequences of his choices. And the law, patiently waiting, was about to answer. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold. He didn't rush. That restraint made what came next far more powerful. Mr. Matthews, he said, lifting a document from the file. I have the medical reports right here. And they tell a very different story than the one you just shared. He paused, allowing the silence to settle. Mr. Castellano suffered a broken hip, a fractured wrist, severe bruising, and a concussion. He spent 8 days in the hospital. He is 74 years old. At that age, a broken hip is not a minor injury. It can be life-threatening. Judge Caprio looked directly at the defendant. Does that sound like you barely touched him? For the first time, Derek Matthews shifted uncomfortably. His confidence faltered just slightly. Well, I didn't mean to hit him that hard, he muttered. It was an accident. An accident. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his voice firm but controlled. An accident is when something happens despite reasonable care. Getting drunk and getting behind the wheel is not an accident. That's a choice. Hitting a pedestrian is a consequence of that choice. Leaving him injured on the ground and driving away is another choice. He held up 3 fingers. You made 3 separate decisions that night, Mr. Matthews. None of them were accidents. The judge reached for another report. Let's talk about your blood alcohol content. According to the police report, you were stopped 2 blocks from the scene. Your BAC was 0.18. The courtroom stirred. That is more than twice the legal limit. You weren't impaired. You were intoxicated. Dangerously intoxicated. The public defender stood trying to regain control. Your Honor, my client has no prior criminal record. He's employed full-time. He's willing to accept responsibility. Accept responsibility? Judge Caprio interrupted, his tone sharp now. He just minimized the injuries of a 74-year-old man who nearly lost his life. He blamed the victim. That is not responsibility. That is denial. Then something changed. Judge Caprio's voice softened, not with mercy, but with gravity. Mr. Matthews, let me tell you about the man you hit. He paused. Antonio Castellano. Tony is my neighbor. But more importantly, he's a human being you never bothered to learn anything about. The courtroom leaned in. Tony came to this country from Italy 52 years ago. He worked as a stonemason his entire life. He built walls and patios across Providence structures that will outlast both of us. Judge Caprio spoke slowly, deliberately. He raised 3 children. All of them became teachers. He's been married to his wife Maria for 49 years. Every summer he plants a garden and gives the vegetables away. Tomatoes, zucchini, basil, no charge, no expectation, just kindness. The judge swallowed. For 23 years, every morning at 6 o'clock, I've watched Tony from my kitchen window while I drink my coffee. Rain or shine, he's out there tending his garden like it's part of him. He looked back at Matthews. After 8 days of the hospital and weeks of physical therapy, do you know what he's worried about? Not his pain, not his fear of falling again. He's worried about his tomatoes. The silence was complete. And here's what troubles me most. Judge Caprio continued, his voice hardening again. When police found you sitting at a red light, 2 blocks away, do you know what you said? Matthews said nothing. Judge Caprio read directly from the report. I didn't do anything wrong. That old man shouldn't have been in the road. He set the paper down. Mr. Castellano wasn't in the road. He was on the sidewalk tending garden boxes the city permits him to maintain. You swerved onto the sidewalk because you were drunk. You hit him because you were impaired. And you left because you were more concerned about yourself than the man you injured. He leaned forward. Every part of this was your fault. The courtroom understood now. This was no longer about sympathy. It was about truth. And the truth was closing in. The courtroom had gone still in a way that couldn't be commanded. It happened naturally when truth finally reached the people listening. Judge Caprio glanced down at the file once more, then slowly looked up. Before I impose sentence, he said, the law allows me to hear from the victim or the victim's family. Mr. Castellano is still in physical therapy and cannot be here today, but his daughter is present. He turned toward the gallery. Ms. Angela Castellano Martinez, would you please come forward? A woman in her early 40s rose from her seat. She had been quiet throughout the hearing, tears appearing and disappearing as the facts unfolded. Now, as she walked toward the stand, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what she carried. She took a breath. Your Honor. Angela began, her voice unsteady. My father is the strongest man I know. She paused, steadying herself. He came to this country with nothing. He worked his entire life. He never complained, never asked for help, never expected special treatment. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Derek Matthews, then back to the judge. But after this man hit him and left him on the sidewalk, my father spent 8 days in the hospital. He lost 30 pounds. He's in constant pain. Her voice cracked. He cries at night, Your Honor. My father, who I have never seen cry, not even when his own mother died, cries himself to sleep because he's afraid he'll never walk normally again. The courtroom held its breath. He's afraid he'll never be able to tend his garden. He's afraid he's become a burden to my mother. Angela turned fully toward Matthews now, and the worst part, she said softly. My father still doesn't blame you. He says maybe he shouldn't have been outside so early. Maybe he should have been more careful. Her voice rose with quiet disbelief. He's 74 years old and he's blaming himself for being hit by a drunk driver. She swallowed hard. That's the kind of man he is. Angela turned back to Judge Caprio. My father didn't want me to come today. He didn't want to make trouble, but I had to, because someone needs to speak for him. Someone needs to say that leaving him broken and bleeding on the sidewalk was wrong. Her voice broke completely now. I almost lost him, Your Honor. The doctor said if he had been there much longer, the internal bleeding could have killed him. She took a breath that sounded like grief finally escaping. This man went home. He went to sleep, while my father was lying on the sidewalk calling for help. She shook her head slowly. What kind of person does that? When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Caprio sat motionless for several seconds. His eyes glistened, not with anger, but with something heavier. Thank you, Ms. Castellano, he said quietly. You may return to your seat. As Angela stepped away, Judge Caprio adjusted himself behind the bench. When he spoke again, his voice was steady but unmistakably changed. Mr. Matthews, he said, what you've just heard is the human cost of your choices. He leaned forward slightly. This sentence is not about my personal relationship with the victim. It is not about emotion. It is about the law, accountability, and the protection of the public. Matthews' face had gone pale. His earlier confidence was gone. What stood before the court now was a man finally realizing that this was real and that it was irreversible. Judge Caprio took a breath. For the charge of driving under the influence causing injury, he said, I sentence you to 2 years in state prison. A murmur swept through the room. This is not county jail, he continued. This is state prison. Matthews' knees weakened slightly. For leaving the scene of an accident with injuries, I sentence you to an additional 18 months consecutive. The word consecutive landed like a blow. For reckless endangerment, 1 year also consecutive. Judge Caprio looked directly at him. Your total sentence is 4 years and 6 months in state prison. The courtroom gasped, but Judge Caprio was not finished. Judge Caprio allowed the weight of the sentence to settle before continuing. But punishment in his courtroom was never delivered without purpose. Mr. Matthews, he said, his voice firm but controlled, upon your release from prison, you will be placed on supervised probation for a period of 5 years. Matthews stared straight ahead, barely breathing. During that probation, you are prohibited from consuming alcohol in any form. You will submit to random drug and alcohol testing. You will attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings 3 times per week. The judge paused, then added the next condition with deliberate clarity. You will complete 500 hours of community service at Rhode Island Hospital's emergency room. You will see firsthand what drunk driving does to families, to bodies, to lives. Matthews' hands trembled now. This was no longer abstract. This was permanent. And your driver's license, Judge Caprio continued, is not suspended. He looked directly at the defendant. It is permanently revoked in the state of Rhode Island. You will never legally drive here again. If you seek a license in another state, I will personally notify their Department of Motor Vehicles of the reason you lost yours. The room was silent. Judge Caprio reached for one final document. I am also ordering full restitution to Mr. Castellano for medical expenses, rehabilitation costs, lost income, and pain and suffering. The amount currently stands at $87,000. Any future medical costs related to this incident will also be your responsibility. Matthews' attorney scribbled furiously, already thinking ahead, but Matthews barely noticed. His face had gone ashen. Then Judge Caprio leaned forward. "There is one more thing I need to address." His voice lowered not in volume but in intensity. "You stood in this courtroom and blamed a 74-year-old man for being in his own neighborhood. That statement revealed something deeply troubling about your character." He held Matthews' gaze. It showed a lack of empathy, a refusal to accept responsibility, and a dangerous belief that your inconvenience mattered more than someone else's life. Judge Caprio paused. "So I am giving you 4.5 years to think about that. 4.5 years to reflect on what it means to hurt someone and walk away. 4.5 years to develop the empathy and character you lacked when you chose to drive drunk." His voice softened just slightly. "I believe in rehabilitation. I believe people can change. I believe in second chances when someone shows genuine remorse." He shook his head slowly. "But you showed none. Not when you spoke. Not when you blamed the victim. Not even after hearing his daughter describe her father's suffering." Judge Caprio straightened. "What I saw was fear, not remorse. Fear of consequences. And that tells me prison is not just punishment for you. It is necessary." He lifted the gavel. "Do you have anything to say before I make this sentence official?" For the first time, Derek Matthews' voice shook. "Your Honor, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I'm sorry." Judge Caprio nodded once. "I believe you're sorry you're here. I don't believe you're sorry for what you did." He raised the gavel. Sentence is entered. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. Final, unmistakable, heavy. As the court officers moved in, the sound of handcuffs closing echoed softly through the room. Derek Matthews' legs buckled for a moment, not in defiance, not in anger, but under the sudden weight of reality. 4.5 years in state prison was no longer an idea. It was his future. As he was led away, his eyes locked briefly with Angela Castellano Martinez. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no victory, only sadness. The sadness of a family that never asked for this pain. The sadness of consequences that came too late to undo harm. When the courtroom doors closed behind Matthews, Judge Frank Caprio remained seated, his head lowered. For a moment, the professional distance he had held so carefully slipped away. Everyone in the room could feel it, the quiet cost of doing what was right. Sentencing a man to prison is never easy. It is even harder when the victim is someone you know, someone you care about. Judge Caprio looked toward Angela. "Please give Tony my best," he said gently. "Tell him his garden will be there when he's ready to return. Tell him the whole neighborhood is rooting for him." Angela nodded, tears flowing freely now. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. "Thank you for seeing my father, for really seeing him." The video of that sentencing spread quickly, but not because it was dramatic or sensational. It spread because people recognized something rare. A judge who did not hide from a conflict of interest, but faced it openly. A judge who did not soften the law to protect his own heart. A judge who chose fairness over comfort. Legal experts debated the sentence. Some called it harsh. Others called it necessary. But when Derek Matthews appealed, arguing Judge Caprio should have recused himself, the Rhode Island Supreme Court disagreed. They noted one simple truth. Matthews had been offered a different judge. He declined. And the law had been applied exactly as written. 6 months into his sentence, Matthews wrote a letter from prison. In it, he admitted he had been living in denial. He wrote about attending AA meetings behind bars, about listening to other inmates describe how alcohol had destroyed their lives. For the first time he wrote, he was beginning to understand what real remorse felt like. Judge Caprio responded with a short letter. Professional, measured, human. "You have 4.5 years," he wrote, "to become the person you should have been before you got behind the wheel. Don't waste them." 1 year after the incident, Tony Castellano returned to his garden. He walked with a cane now. He moved more slowly, but every morning just as before he was outside at 6 a.m. tending his plants. That summer, the tomatoes were the best he had ever grown. As he handed a basket to Judge Caprio, Tony smiled and said quietly, "Thank you for being fair, Frank. I know that wasn't easy." Justice doesn't always feel good. It doesn't always bring closure. But when it is guided by honesty, accountability, and courage, it protects what matters most. If you believe drunk driving deserves real consequences, if you believe judges should be transparent and brave enough to do what's right, and if stories like this remind you why justice still matters, please like this video and subscribe. Because when justice becomes personal, character is revealed. And Judge Frank Caprio showed the world what real integrity looks like.